Hi, I'm Karen. We're here at Montevilla Sewing Center, and today we're going to talk about how to sew a buttonhole, a one-step buttonhole, on a basic mechanical machine. Now, if you have a machine that has a little symbol like this can do a one-step buttonhole, okay, as opposed to a four-step buttonhole, and we're going to have another video on how to do those kind. One-step buttonhole. The machines that do that have this kind of foot right here. And this foot is, you pull this out like this, you put your button right in here, and it's going to make a buttonhole that fits that button. And it's going to make each buttonhole you make consistently the same size. Okay, to set your machine up for making the one-step buttonhole, first of all, you want to have your stitch width dial all the way to maximum, so as wide as it can be. Then you want to move your selector, either buttons or a dial, to the one-step buttonhole right there. Then you want to move your stitch length down to here. And the stitch length in this case is about 0.5, about halfway between 0 and 1. So nice short stitch length. Okay, now to put the, first of all, I'm going to show you something about the buttonhole foot itself. It has these little grippers at the bottom. Those are to grip the fabric so that as you're sewing along, all the layers stay together. And then it also has, if you can see, there are the two little channels which represent the sides of the button. Those little channels are there because that's a lot of thread that's being put into your fabric, and so you want to make sure that that has some place to go. But also, that little center thing between the two channels is where you're going to line up your marking on your fabric so that you get your buttonhole right exactly where you want it to be. Okay, so I'm going to put this on this machine. Sometimes it helps to lift up the presser foot a little higher if you can to get that fitted on there. And this kind of foot does not have a slit anywhere to put your thread in. So what I like to do is just take one stitch and then pull my fabric out of there, and that pulls the thread through. A little trick for doing that. Okay, now we want to mark the center line and the beginning of our buttonhole. You don't need to mark both ends of the buttonhole because the length of the buttonhole is going to be determined by the button. Okay, here I've got my center line, and I'm marking a little cross line. Now, I should tell you something about this pen. This happens to be the friction pen. What this does is these marks here will disappear on this light-colored fabric if I touch it with a hot iron or I use the little the friction eraser on the end. So I like a pen like this. I'm still making my marks nice and small. There are a lot of different kinds of pens that you can use to make temporary marks on your fabric. Some of them disappear with more or less success, and some of them even come back. So in order to avoid that, what I do is I make my marks small enough, like this is going to go right down the center, and that's going to be cut away when we cut the buttonhole. And this one right here is going to be covered up by the bar tack at the beginning. So, again, we could lift up our presser foot a little higher so it doesn't drag on those rubber grippers. And I don't know if you can see, but what I did, remember that dip in the plastic? I lined that right up with that, the long line. Now I'm going to gently lower my needle just to make sure it's even with the short cross mark. And it is. Okay. Now, one thing that we need to do that's really important is to pull down the buttonhole lever right here. It's behind your threader, right back here. That has a mark on it that is similar to these marks here. So always make sure you do that. In some machines, what I'll do is as soon as I select buttonhole, I'll immediately pull that down. That helps me remember to do that. Another thing you want to do is make sure the edge of your fabric is parallel with the edge of the foot. You could have everything lined up in the center just right, but if it's cockeyed, guess what? Your buttonhole is also going to be cockeyed, so you want it straight. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hold my thread tails and give it a start, and it gives a little. So what this did is it gave us a bar tack at the beginning and a bar tack at the end. I didn't do anything else, just let it go. Now when it gets to the end on this one, we want to stop at that point. You don't want to keep sewing because the thread will just kind of glob up. So you just stop at this point. And then you take your fabric out of there, and there you have your buttonhole. So what do we do now? Well, the first thing I like to do is take my beginning thread tails, and notice I haven't cut it off from the machine yet. I take my beginning thread tails and I trim those off. That way, the ending thread tails, when I cut them away from the machine, I know which is which. The beginning thread tails have already had stitches stitched across them, so they are locked into the fabric, but the ending thread tails could come loose, so we don't want that to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull these through. Could have my darning needle here, but I don't have it right now. That's fine. There's usually a stitch that will show through from the front. There, I've got it right now. And then we just tie these in a nice little square knot. And that is one way that you can make your home sewn, personally sewn buttonholes better than ready to wear, because you've taken the time to secure your threads. You can also take a darning needle and put those underneath the layers of fabric there. Then the next thing, of course, we need to do is cut that buttonhole, and you use your seam ripper for that. It's a good idea to guard the end of the buttonhole so that you don't accidentally cut through that bar tack at the end. So I start at this end here, cut towards the center, but not all the way up to the pin, because I flip it over, replace my pin on the already cut end. Then I start on the other end and cut towards the place I already cut. Okay. Now we have our buttonhole. And these extra little threads, that's another way you can make your home sewn garment look really spiffy, is just to trim out those extra threads and make it nice and beautiful. I like to have my garments that I sew, my projects, look beautiful, and I can do that when I sew it myself. Okay, so I'm going to test this buttonhole, and that's another thing I should bring up. When you sew a buttonhole, always test it on the same kind of fabric, maybe even a sample of the same fabric that you're using for your garment or your project. So you sew that buttonhole, then take your button out and test it to make sure that it fits through. And it should fit a little bit snug, because you don't want your buttons to come unbuttoned by themselves, believe me. So it should fit a little bit snug. If it's really snug, it's probably because your button is thicker. And in that case, what you would do, if you had your button in here, you'd pull this out just a little bit, maybe like one click. And that makes it a little bit looser, so that buttonhole is going to be a little bit longer. And then sew another test sample. Try your button, your thick button again, and see if it goes in a little bit better. Now, one thing you might notice with this buttonhole, these stitches look a little bit like they're too far apart. There's two things you could do about that. First, what you could do is sew around a second time. So that's denser. Another thing you could do is shorten your stitch length. So you can shorten that by a click or two. And then try it again and see if you can get them closer. You don't want them too close, because then it's like stitching in place and it's not moving forward at all. So experiment with that. It's going to depend on your thread and your fabric as to how dense those are going to be. If I had the same color of thread as fabric, you probably wouldn't notice that at all. And most of the time, you're going to be having the same color of thread as fabric. So that's buttonholes on a basic mechanical machine, the one-step buttonhole. We have lots of other videos on our YouTube channel, so stay tuned and thanks for watching. Bye.